Okay, well, good morning. It is Monday, April 20th, and today we're talking about the Metamorphosis. Let's see there. So today we're going to read the first chapter in the Metamorphosis. There are three, and so I want to talk a little bit about the beginning of the story and give you some keys to look for as you read, and then you'll be on your way. So this was written in 1915 by Franz Kafka, like the other stories we've been reading, and written originally in German, as were all of his stories. But that particular issue, I think, is important for us to remember as we read the first couple lines of the story, because there are some key words that are translated in a particular way that I want to take a look at. So, first of all, let's think about the title itself, the Metamorphosis. A metamorphosis is used to usually describe the change in form or nature of something from one type to another, and that's usually through some natural process, like a caterpillar metamorphosing into a butterfly, or supernaturally, in like God transferring the nature of one thing into something else. As like for instance in the Bible with Jesus turning water into wine. There's a metamorphosis. So those are really the two kinds of ways we use the word metamorphosis. I think it's interesting that we usually in the natural world think of it in terms of insects, because those are the kinds of creatures that do metamorphose. And so keep that in mind as we read. In the natural world, when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it's a move from an immature state to a mature state. And I don't know if that has anything to do with this story necessarily, but it's just something to think about. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is the title character's name, or the main character's name, I should say. So that's Gregor Samsa. So we've got Gregor, which probably looks familiar because it's the same letters as the main character in The Judgment, which we read last week, right? Just rearranged a little bit. And then Samsa is interesting for two reasons. Number one, if you just write the word Samsa down over the word Kafka, you'll see that they are very, very similar. The vowels are in the same places, there's the same number of letters, the consonants are in the same places. So it's not a very sneaky way of saying that this is in some ways autobiographical. Another interesting thing about that word Samsa is that the Czech word samsha, which is Samsja, it means being alone. And remember that Kafka was Czech, so he was Jewish and he lived in the Czech Republic. So he's managed to say with that name that this character is in some way autobiographical, and that it's also in some way about being alone. So, cool. All right, now I want to read the first line of the story, which is one of the most famous first lines of all stories. Really, just about every educated adult can quote this line for you, and definitely at least recognize where it's from if they were to hear it. So here you go. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, Chapter 1. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Okay, I want to break down that sentence for just a moment. All right, so first of all, we get that name. Second of all, he had uneasy dreams the night before, and this is not a going into a nightmare where he turns into an insect. This is a coming awake to become an insect. So this change into an insect is an awakening. It's not a nightmare, right? Which is important to remember, because in literature, awakenings are usually when a character realizes the truth of something that they hadn't noticed before. So essentially what he's saying here is that waking up as he calls it here, a gigantic insect, was for the first time realizing how things really are. This is an awakening. Um, and then the other thing I wanted to note is that it says he was transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. We don't know how he was transformed. We don't know by what like natural process or supernatural process this happened. Who was behind it? And for Kafka, that's okay because remember he has a hard time ascribing order and purpose to the universe anyway. So the fact that something random like this just happens and there's no actor behind it is totally is, well, of course it is. That just makes sense. That's how the world is. It's insane. So, so there's no reason. I don't want to say there's no reason, but there's no force behind this that we can point to that has made him change until we start talking about maybe some of the symbolism of it. Okay, and then finally the last phrase in that sentence, into a gigantic insect. Now the word he uses there in German is Ungeziefer, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but it's Ungeziefer. And that is the German word that would be more accurately translated as vermin, right? So a vermin is like a nasty, creepy, crawly kind of bug, and it's a kind of a generic term. It's not like a specific species of bug or of insect. So it doesn't tell us that he is particularly a bed bug or a roach or a whatever, right? It's just he's a vermin. And so that has the connotations of being nasty and gross. And then the second interesting thing about the word vermin is that it is also used to mean like unacceptable and specifically an unacceptable sacrifice. And so the idea that he has turned into this unacceptably creepy, gross sacrifice is, I think, telling for what happens in the rest of the story, which we'll get to. Okay, so that's the first line. Now, as the story goes on, basically, the situation is that he is woken up and he is now this vermin, this insect, and he's gross. But he's still man-sized, and he still thinks like a human. He still seems to have emotions like a human. So the only thing that's changed really is his physical formation, his physical self, which is interesting. It's, in my opinion, I think perhaps that his physical self has now come to match what he already was inside. Right, he was already, at least in his own mind, an insect, a vermin. Okay, so, but his intellectual, emotional selves, they are still the same. And so this may be kind of trying to show us that he has already been dehumanized by his world, and now he has awakened to that reality. Okay, so he's laying there in bed as this insect, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And the thing that he worries about the most is, well, there are two things. First of all is his job, right? His job is really, really important because he is the main breadwinner for the family, right? He supplies all of their financial needs. And one of those key financial needs to keep an eye on is that his parents have debts, and he is working to pay them off. So not only is he the provider for the family, but he's also paying the debts of his parents. And so this brings us to the relationships that he has. He lives with his parents and his sister, and just like in the Judgment, his father is a really overbearing, violent character, and Gregor feels responsible for paying his father's debts, which is another important thing to remember as you go through this. He feels really shameful and guilty about not being able to pay his father's debts. So it's like a reversal of how we would hope that life would work, right? Okay, so there's that. So he's worried about his job and he's worried about his family. he needs to be able to get to work, and his work is really unsatisfying personally, but again, it provides the money for the family. And so his job is as a salesman, and we'll see in the first part, actually, towards the second half of the first chapter, uh, the office manager from his job is going to come and check on him to see why he hasn't come to work. And um, and when his parents say, well, we think maybe he's in there sick, it turns out that that is not an acceptable answer. Like, you can't be sick. You just got to get over it. This is work. And so this points us toward the idea that his job, and maybe all jobs in the 20th century, are just dehumanizing. They don't even take into account the possibility that you have turned into a bug, or that maybe you're sick and you can't be at work. That's just not okay. It's the system moves on, and you've got to be there. So all of those things are going on as Gregor is laying there in bed, and eventually getting out of bed, trying to figure out how to do life as this, 6-foot insect. So keep your eye on the things that he remembers about his life before being transformed into a bug, and also take a look at the effect that this has on his relationships. And as you go, just again, don't be too concerned about finding the deeper meaning right yet. We'll try to come up with that as we finish up the story, but instead just kind of notice as much as you can about the relationships that he's dealing with, about his inner life, how he's dealing with his transformation, and how he's comparing his previous life to the current one. And there's a lot there to notice. So have fun and enjoy. Okay, talk to you tomorrow.